için yem işletmelerinde 21.000 adet hijyen şartları açısından yem resmi kontrolleri planlanmıştı. Yine 2020 yılında yıllık 7.902 adet yem numunesi gerçekleştirmesi planlanmıştı. Yem resmi kontrollerinde Bakanlığımız tarafından oluşturulan gıda güvenliği bilgi sistemi altyapısı kullanılmakta. Mevzuat açısından yem resmi kontrollerinde temel mevzuat 5996 sayılı Veteriner Hizmetleri, Bitki Sağlığı, Gıda ve Yem Kanunu. Yine ülkemizde sadece GDO'lu soy ve mısır bazı çeşitleri Biyogüvenlik Kurulu tarafından onaylanan ve ülkemize sadece bunlar ithalat yoluyla geliyor. Bazı soy ve mısır çeşitlerinin hayvan yemi olarak kullanılmasına onay verilmişti. Bunların da yine hayvan yemlerinde kontrol ve resmi kontrolünü yapmaktayız. Ve bu kapsamda da 5977 sayılı Biyogüvenlik Kanunu'nun ilgili ne dayalı olarak işlemleri yürütüyoruz. Yine 5996 sayılı kanun ve 5977 sayılı kanuna bağlı olarak çıkartılan bazı yönetmelik ve tebliğlerimiz bulunmakta. Bunlar yemlerin piyasaya arzı ve kullanımı hakkında yönetmelik, yem hijyeni yönetmeliği, yemlerde istenmeyen maddeler hakkında tebliğ, hayvan beslemede kullanılan yem katkı maddeleri hakkında yönetmelik, insan tüketimi amacıyla kullanılmayan hayvansal yan ürünler yönetmeliği ve genetiği değiştirilmiş organizma ve ürünlere dair yönetmelik belirtilen hususlara dahil olarak yem resmi kontrollerimizi yürütmekteyiz. 2020 yılı yem resmi kontrollerine ilişkin 2020 yılı gerçekleşme verilerimiz ise 2020 yılında hedefimiz 21.000 adet yem resmi kontrollerinin yapılmasıydı. 2020 yılı içerisinde toplam denetim sayımız 27.969 adet olarak gerçekleştirilmiştir. 2020 yılı numune alma planımızda 7.902 adet resmi kontrol gerçekleştirmesi planlanmıştı. 2020 yılında 8.327 adet yem numunesi kontrol edilmiştir. Yapılan bu kontrolleri de yemlerde yapılan kontrollerde 8.327 adet kontrolden 7.846 adet ürün uygun bulunmuştur. 341 adet yem numunesi uygunsuz olarak bulunmuştur. Ve yapılan bu denetim sonuçlarına ilişkin yani idari para cezaları ve yasal uygulamalar yürütülmektedir. Şikayetler kapsamında da 95 adet ihbar ve şikayet üzerine yem resmi kontrolleri gerçekleştirilmiştir. Yapılan bu kontrollerde de 7 adet uygunsuzluk tespit edilmiştir. Uygunsuz tespit edilen durumlara ilişkin olarak 5996 sayılı kanun gereğince yasal işlemlerimizi yürütmekteyiz. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Ben teşekkür ederim Hidayet Bey sunumunuz için. Süremizi bir hayli aştık, zaten önceki oturumdan da biraz sarkmıştı. Eğer salonda sorusu olan yoksa bir chatten bir soru var. Onu Soner Bey'e yöneltmek isterim. Sunumda 1.3 milyon civarında denetim yapıldığını belirttiniz. Bu denetim sayısının içerisinde kayıtlı olmayan işletmeler var mıdır? Kayıtlı olmayan işletmelerin denetlenme oranı nedir?
Sezen Hanım teşekkür ediyorum. Kısaca bu konuyla ilgili ben bilgi vereyim. 5996 sayılı kanunumuzda 40 ve 41. maddeler ceza maddelerimiz, yani ceza ile ilgili hükümlerin belirlendiği maddeler. Burada da kayıt yaptırması gereken işletmelerden kayıt yaptırmayanlara uygulanacak cezalar, bunların miktarının ne olduğu, yine onaylı işletmelerden onay almadan faaliyette bulunan işletmelerle ilgili olarak hangi cezanın verileceği ile ilgili hükümler yer alıyor. Tabii ki kontrol görevlilerimiz, 7.000 üzerindeki kontrol görevlilerimiz saha denetimde, gıda işletmelerinde yapmış oldukları denetimlerde kayıtsız ve onaysız işletme tespit etmeleri durumunda bu cezayı uyguluyorlar. Bu denetimlerimizin içerisinde kayıtsız ve onaysız işletmelerin denetimleri de mevcut. İçerisinde var.
Anladım. Çok teşekkürler. Sağ olun.
Teşekkür ederim.
Ben tekrar tüm panelistlerimize, katılımcılarımıza teşekkür ediyorum. Bir sonraki oturumda görüşmek üzere diyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Biz teşekkür ederiz. Sağ olun.
Size teşekkür ediyoruz, oturum başkanımıza ve tüm katılımcılarımıza. Bugün sempozyumumuzun ilk gününü tamamlamak üzereyiz. Bundan sonra bir özel oturumumuz var. Dileyen katılımcılarımız o özel oturuma da katılabilirler. Ama genel oturumlarımız bugün sona erdi. Yarın 5 oturum, 30 konuşmacıyla sabah saat 9.30'da yine birlikte olacağız. Mutlu akşamlar diliyoruz. Çok yoğun bilgi edindik. Bu akşam bunları demlendireceğiz. Yarın da yeni konuklarla birlikte olacağız. İyi akşamlar diliyoruz. Özel oturumumuzda piyasa gözetimi denetiminde risk değerlendirmesi konusunu Uluslararası Piyasa Gözetimi ve Denetimi uzmanı Sayın Torben Rahbek anlatacak.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And I'm happy to see that there are still people that are around here, and I'm very impressed by that. So thank you very much. I think it's a big pleasure for me to be here and to be able to give this exclusive session on risk assessment. Let me just try to share my screen. And then let's see if we can. Didn't work. There we go. I hope you can see this slide with risk assessment and market surveillance. What I will do is that I will discuss what is risk assessment in market surveillance. And my purpose of today is to try to make you understand what is the risk assessment method that is published in the risk assessment guidelines from the European Commission. How does this method work, and how can you use it? And also, what is it not possible to use this method for? I also want to show you something about how you can apply the method in a number of tricky cases so that you are able to handle common pitfalls and common situations that may occur. Timing-wise, I have tried to insert a little break somewhere halfway through the presentation because I can see it has been a very long day for a lot of you. And I will also try to speed through some parts of the presentation so that we can try to catch up on the time that's and try to finish in time. Risk assessment in market surveillance. Well, let's begin by discussing what is risk assessment in general. And in general, risk assessment is the process whereby you can determine how dangerous a product is to a user. Risk assessment can be applied by businesses. Risk assessment can be applied by authorities. It can be applied at any stage during the whole lifetime of a product. And you have probably come across, or you may know, that there are many different models and tools depending upon the use. So those of you who have been working with machinery, you would probably be familiar with the 12-100 method that is described in the standards. People that had worked with chemicals would know that chemical risk assessment is something very different from what we're doing here. So there are different methods, there are different tools that can be used. Risk assessment, I said, could be used at any stage over the lifetime of the product. We have what is called pre-market risk assessment. Risk assessment that is carried out before the product has been placed on the market. It is normally applied by the businesses, and the purpose is to check that all hazards in the product have been analyzed and have been adequately mitigated so that the product can be sold and the manufacturer can assume that the product is safe. Then we also have post-market surveillance or post-market risk assessment, the sort of risk assessment that is being undertaken by market surveillance authorities after the product has been placed on the market. It can also be undertaken by businesses, but it's most usual to find that it's market surveillance authorities that are working on the post-market risk assessment. It applies to products that are already on the market, and the purpose is to find out what can we do if we find out that a product is unsafe. What can we do to take it off the market? What would be the most appropriate action that we should take against this product? Let me skip that slide and go directly to this one. In a market surveillance context, risk assessment fits into this three-stage process I have outlined on this slide. The first step is that you make a compliance assessment of a product. You may take the product from a market surveillance action, and then you will test it. And the purpose of the first step is to find out, does the product meet all the requirements given in the standard? If you find that the product does not comply, if there are errors in the product, then you move into the risk assessment. You try to clarify how risky are these non-compliances to the consumer. And if you find that these risks are unacceptable to the consumer, then you move into the third stage, risk management. You try to find out how can you remove the risk from the consumer. So remember this three-stage thing: compliance assessment, risk assessment, and risk management. You may ask yourself, why do we see risk assessment as being so important? Because it would also be possible to say that a product fails to meet the legal requirements, so we just remove it from the market. Well, the reason is that legislation requires it. The legislation, the General Product Safety Directive, and also the new Market Surveillance Regulation 2019/1020, both speak about risk, products that represent an unacceptable risk. Member states should take action against risky products. Action must be justified by means of a risk assessment. So risk is this concept that goes through all the legislation. And moreover, risk assessment could help you to fulfill the principle of proportionality. And it's a principle that says that a severe crime, severe offense should require a heavy punishment, whereas a mild offense would require a mild punishment. Risk assessment can feed into that process or feed into that discussion. Let me just skip these slides and go to here and say that this training I'm giving here tonight is based on the Commission Implementing Decision 2019/417. It is the risk assessment guidelines that are used for the RAPEX method. And the good thing about this risk assessment tool is that it forces or nudges the market surveillance officers to describe all the considerations they are doing very explicitly. And this is very, very good because it increases transparency and makes it a lot more easy for a market surveillance officer to discuss with the business and to explain why the inspector has arrived at the conclusion that he has drawn. If you want to read more, there is a thorough description in the EMAS book that is called Best Practice Techniques in Market Surveillance. You can find it on ProSafe's website. But you also find a very thorough guideline with a good example on the Commission website. And just to stress, risk assessment following this method is not science. It's still open for discussion. It's still open for debate, and you can be. There's no one correct answer you can say here. So in that sense, it's not science, but it is a very good tool that supports your discussions of risks with the manufacturer. You suddenly have a framework that you can use when you're discussing. It helps your decision making. It's easier to draw the decision that you find is correct when you have followed a risk assessment method like this one. My experience is also that it makes the decisions much more objective. It's simply not possible to hide subjective statements or subjective assessments because you're forced to explain every time what you're doing. And it offers or it helps you make some plausible explanations of the decisions that you're making. As I said before, it also increases transparency. And all in all, the experience from the authorities is that it makes it possible to have a meaningful communication with businesses about how risky their products really are. So there are a lot of good reasons for using this method. Let me just dive a bit into the theory behind the risk assessment. As you know, risk is the combination of severity and probability. So if you want to arrive at a high risk, you must have something that is rather severe, and it must be pretty possible that it could happen. If you have something that is very severe, but the probability is almost zero, then the risk will be low. So risk is the probability of severity, is the combination of probability and severity. Risk assessment builds on these three questions, you can say. What can go wrong? What are the consequences if it actually happens? And how likely is it that this will actually go wrong? And you can see that the two first questions already outline this whole severity thing. What can go wrong? Is it possible for a consumer to get injured? Will a house burn down? What can go wrong? And how severe is it? What is the consequences if this actually goes wrong? These two, 1 and 2 together, would describe the severity of the hazard. And number 3 is then a question about probability. How likely is it that it will happen? Clearly probability. So you can see in this way, we have covered the severity and the probability, and then we just need to put them together to get the risk. If you look at the EMAS book on ProSafe's website, there is this little figure that explains some of the data things, some of the data that goes into a risk assessment of a product. And let me just go a little bit into detail with that. Of course, some of the input that you can see on the left side of this figure, some of the input is the product itself. when you're doing risk assessment, it's a very big advantage to have the product at hand so that you can see it, you can see how it works, you can feel it, you can get a sense of how likely is it that something will happen, that things can break off, that things can cut, etc. It is also an advantage to have some specific injury data. If you are looking at a product that has caused an accident, it would be a very good idea to have information from the consumer explaining how the consumer got hurt, because you can input that into your analysis. And of course, test reports. You have presumably tested this product before you start the risk assessment. And therefore, you need to have the test report to see what did the laboratory find? What were the errors that they pointed to? You're using tools shown in the bottom of the slide. Tools could be different databases. It could be general injury statistics from hospitals, for instance. And in some sectors, you will find toolboxes that contains different tables, list of data, other interesting stuff that you could put into the risk assessment. I think this is mostly the case within the chemical sector and not in the mechanical sector. And then the output is shown on the top right. The output of such an exercise is the risk level, of course, but it's also the uncertainty, and that is very important to have that, because you need to understand how secure, how certain can you be on the result that you have come up with. And I will come back to that later when we discuss how to report a risk assessment. The whole risk assessment process is shown here, and it contains a lot of different steps, but let's go through them slowly one by one. The first step in the process is to describe the product that you're assessing. What is the product? What are the risks or the accidents you're investigating? Do you have any test reports? Please remember to make references so that you're sure that you can link this report to the correct product. Once you have the product, the next you want to find out is which are the hazards with the product that you need to consider. In this case, you may get help from the test reports from the laboratory, because they will have checked the product and they will have come up with a number of non-compliances or hazards that you could have a look at. It may also be that you have an accident report from the consumer. My finger was cut because there was something sharp at the product, but then that is your hazard. So this step means you have to identify the hazards that you want to examine for this product. Then you need to consider who are the consumers of the product. Are we talking about very small children? Are we talking about adults? Are we talking about elderly people? Because it will have an influence on how the hazards and how the hazards can manifest themselves, how the hazards can injure the consumers. Just think of that children use products in a different way than adults, so there will be differences there, of course. You have to consider the injury. How can the hazard injure the consumer? So that would be something like, if you are considering sharp edges, the injuries are something like cutting. If you're considering small parts, the injuries are related to swallowing and getting suffocated, etc., etc. And when you're considering the injury, you should also consider the severity of the injury. Because, of course, there's a huge difference between getting a small cut, a small wound on a finger, or getting a cut that will cut your arm off, or, well, perhaps even cut your throat. You need to consider what kind of injury and how severe an injury do you consider in this context, in your risk assessment. Now we can begin to combine all of these. We combine the hazards, the consumers, and the injury, and we combine that into what is called an injury scenario. Injury scenarios looks terribly difficult, but it isn't. Injury scenarios are just stories of 3, 4, 5 lines that explains how the product, how the hazardous products injures the consumer. You can imagine that if you have a toy with a small part that can be detached, then an injury scenario could be something like this toy has a small part. The small part can be easily detached. A child detaches the part, the child swallows the part, and the part goes into the lungs so that surgery is necessary to remove it. That's just 5 lines or 5 sentences that describes how the hazard will injure the consumer. And these are the kind of stories you should develop, ideally one for each of the hazards that you have come up with. After you've had this little story written down, you need to consider the probabilities. What is the probability that this will actually happen? And I will show you later on exactly how this is done. But for the moment, let's just say that we need to find the probability that the injury scenario will actually take place. We combine the injury scenario with the probability. And this means you have this severity multiplied by probability, and that will give you the risk level. And then you can say that the risk assessment, the basic risk assessment, has been done. Let me try to give you a practical example. And what I will do is that I will analyze an old RAPEX notification made by Germany. I have taken this one because it is the one that is being used in ProSafe's e-learning tool. And I've inserted the path here, how you can access the tool. Go to prosafe.org. From there, you click on horizontal topics, and then you can go to risk assessment. And somewhere on the web page where you land, you will find a link to the e-learning tool. This case, this notification 244/08, it considers a toaster where it is possible for the consumer to get the fingers inside the toaster and touch the heating elements while they are energized. So it's a toaster where the user can get an electric shock by putting the fingers into the toaster, and that's clearly dangerous. I will show you how to use the Commission's risk assessment tool, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, because it's a very, very good online tool and it's free for use. Everybody can enter this website and just go ahead and use it. And I really recommend it. It's a very, very good tool. I've also inserted the web address on this tool, on this slide. It's ec.europa.eu/RAG. That will take you immediately to the landing page of this tool. I will go through these stages one by one. They correspond to the little boxes we just saw. Let's describe the product. Let's describe the consumer, the hazard, the injury scenario, severity, the probability. And finally, we will calculate the risk level. And after that, we will come back and discuss how do we evaluate the risk assessment and how do we finalize it in an appropriate way. This is a product, a toaster. And as I said, the problem is that the user can get the finger into the slot at the top of the toaster and touch the heating elements. And the tricky thing is that, or the risky thing is that this is possible. The toaster only breaks on one pole. So it means that it's actually possible that the user may assume that this toaster is interrupted because it's not hot. But there's still live parts immediately inside the slot that you can get in touch with. Some of this information is something that we should put into the description of the product. If you go to the rack tool, which is shown here bottom right. The first field all deals with the product. So you can see we insert what is the product. It's an electric toaster. What is the category? We select from a drop-down menu, electrical appliances and equipment. And then the little yellow box in the bottom contains a description of the product. And this is where I suggest that you enter all the information that you have about the product. Just written electric toaster with easily accessible live parts. But you might just as well here add a reference to your case information system, brand name, etc. of the toaster, detailed descriptions of accidents, if you have that, etc., etc. All the information that you want to have in the risk assessment report when you're finished. Next, you have to identify the product hazard, and it's done in 2 stages. The first stage is that you identify the hazard group. And here I have selected electrical energy. You have some very high level descriptions. Electrical energy is the one that applies to our case. Once you have selected electrical energy, you should elect hazard. And now you can only select different hazards that are related to electric energy. In this case, the correct one is high or low voltage. So that's the one we click. Then we come back to the scenarios, or we begin to describing the scenarios. And we should select the consumer type. In this case, we imagine that this toaster is being used by adults, and adults are called other consumers in this system. So that's the one we select. But you could see it would also be possible to select young children. If you want to write a scenario for the situation that a child comes home, takes a toaster because the child wants to have some food, it's possible then to write up a scenario describing that situation, to analyze it and see if it will end up in a more situation. Next, we begin on writing down the injury scenarios. And what you can see is that once you have filled in the hazard group and the hazard, then the system itself will come up and say, okay, I have a default scenario that you may choose. And you can see the arrow points to it here. Person can touch part of the product that is at high voltage. The person receives an electric shock and may be electrocuted. If you find that this scenario describes the situation that you want to analyze, then you just click the little copy button on top of the arrow, and then you will have copied the scenario to your scenario. But we want to go a little bit more into detail, because I recommend again that you spend some time developing these injury scenarios so that they're easier to analyze. So therefore, I have written my own injury scenario in the top of this, in the box in the top with the yellow arrow. And you can see that the scenario goes, the toaster is plugged into a socket outlet. So the heating elements are connected to the phase conductor. The person touches the heating element, the person sustains an electric shock, and the person dies. This is the level of detail that you have to go into when you're describing the injury scenarios. But to describe this, you have to go down and then select what are the injury that we are looking at. So you go into the yellow box that is called your injury, and here we select electric shock. Once you have selected electric shock, this little box opens and gives you the opportunity, or gives you possibility to choose between 4 different levels of severity, coming all the way from very light burns down to the most severe level, electrocution and death. And in our case, if you remember, the injury scenario ended with the sentence, the person gets an electric shock and dies. So we have to select number 4. And then we look into the injury scenario, and we should begin to discuss probabilities. First step in this is to build the scenario, and I have tried to list it here, separating the sentences one by one so that it is clear which are the steps in the scenario. So step number one, the toaster is plugged into a socket so that the heating elements are energized, even though the switch is off. Step number two, the person touches the heating element. Step number three, the person sustains an electric shock. And step number four, the person is electrocuted and dies. And again, it is necessary to go into this level of detail and explicitness because it makes it easier to estimate the probabilities afterwards. When you want to estimate the probabilities, then you go step by step. What is the probability that step number one will happen? And then you enter, I recommend that you write, this is the estimate, and then you explain why do you come up with this level. And the first point, what is the probability that the toaster is plugged into the socket outlet in such a way that the heating element are energized even though the switch is off? Well, I would say that the probability is 50% because the switch can go that way or that way. So one of two, and that would be 50%, of course. And these two are equally likely. So yeah, that's why it's 50%. Next probability, next step is to estimate the probability. How likely is it that a person will touch the heating elements? We don't have the toaster at hand, so therefore we have to guess. But in reality, what you would do is that you would take the toaster and you would put it on a table, and then you could sit with your fingers, put it into the toaster and see how easy it is to get in touch with the elements. Of course, you don't need to plug it in to do this exercise. Try to play with the product and see how likely it is. In this case, I've just guessed that the chance is 1 in 100. Could be correct, could be wrong. We don't know when we don't have the product. Step number 3, what is the probability that the person will sustain an electric shock? Well, that is 100%. If the product is plugged in, if the heating elements are energized, and the user touches the heating elements, then he will get an electric shock, that's for sure. And again, this is something, examine the product, that would be what we would do in reality to see how realistic this is. The fourth step is, what is the probability that the user will die from this electric shock? And this is where you probably need to look into databases, or you need to search the internet to see if there are scientific articles describing that. Because you don't automatically die just because you receive an electric shock. It depends upon a lot of things like the resistance between you and the floor, how easy is it for the current to go from the electrical product through your body and into ground. There has been a lot of studies carried out on this, and in this case, we ended up with a 25% probability when the group I was working with assessed this case. But it could be higher, it could be lower. I know that many electricians say that they have suffered several electric shocks during their career, and they're still alive, all of them. So, yeah. You have to make this sort of analysis every time that you have one of these steps where you want to estimate the probability. Anyway, now we have the probabilities, we have the steps, and then we enter them into the RAG tool. What you do here is that there is a field where you can add steps. So that is what you do. You may, in this case, we add the 4 steps that are we have analyzed. And then you write them one by one in the leftmost column. you'll see in the top it says the toaster is plugged into a socket, so the heating elements are energized, even though the switch is off. So that is simply step number 1 that is written here. I've made this text fairly short, but it would be a very good idea also to include your reasoning. Why did you end up in the probability that you ended up with? Because then you have this documented if you have to discuss this with the manufacturer afterwards. In the middle column, you can see that I have inserted, or in the right column, I've inserted all the probabilities: 0.5, 0.01, 1, and 0.25. One thing to note here is that you must enter this as 0.25, not 0.25 as we would normally write. If you put the wrong character in the field, the system crashes. The combination of the probability and the injury severity level is done in this matrix that is shown in the RAPEX guidelines. But basically what you can see is that you have all the probabilities listed next to the vertical arrow: more than 50%, more than 1 in 10, more than 1 in 100. And then you have the severity levels listed 1, 2, 3, 4 on top of each of the columns in this table. And then it has been decided by this expert group that developed the method that certain combinations of probability and severity would mean serious risk, and those are the red squares. So you have some red squares, some orange squares with high risk, and you have medium risk in the yellow squares. The severity of the injury level, at the bottom of this slide, you will see that the system has calculated the overall risk. The severity of the injury is 4. The calculated probability is 0.00125, which translates into the column that is called more than 1 in 1,000. Injury level 4 combined with more than 1 in 1,000 means serious risk. You just try to draw the arrows yourself. Then we need to finalize the risk assessment in the correct way. And this means that there are 4 things that you need to go through every time. First, a reality check of the risk assessment, then a sensitivity analysis. You need to consider reporting of the case, and you need to consider quality assurance of your case. Let me just spend a little time on each of these. The reality check means that you, well, literally roll the chair back from the table, you look into the ceiling, and then you ask yourself, is this risk assessment really realistic? Can this injury scenario take place? Have I ended up with the correct level of risk, etc.? I remember I participated once in a meeting where a manufacturer was trying to blame his competitor of producing unsafe products, in this case cigarette lighters. So they came up with this example. They said, this is an accident that could happen. If the lighter breaks, then gas will get out, it can ignite, and it will cause a fireball that will kill the user. The probability for this happening, they said, was 1 in 100, and the severity was, of course, extreme because you would kill the consumers. So all in all, they said, this is a very dangerous product. It must be taken off the market immediately. Then I was with a colleague in this meeting and said, no, that can't be true. Because remember, you are selling this very model of lighter in millions and millions. So if the probability was 1 in 100 that people would die from this, then you would see bodies floating everywhere in the streets because people had died from using the lighters. That's clearly not the case. So this risk assessment is not realistic. It is way too severe. You have to go back and reconsider things. What you can do if you come across such questions is try to look into accident statistics, like my colleague actually did here. You can say, Try to ask the manufacturers if they have a complaint register where they have registered some of these things. And try to remember that market surveillance people tend to be worst case thinkers, while manufacturers tend to be very optimistic when they're considering their products. You have to make a sensitivity analysis. And the sensitivity analysis is really very simple to carry out in this tool, because the question is, how much do I need to vary the parameters, the input parameters, the probabilities? How much do I need to vary them to flip from one risk level to the next one? Because that will tell you something about this, how sensitive your result is. If you just have to move the probability from 5% to 7% to change the risk level from medium to high, then you know you have a result that is very sensitive. And then you need to look into the risk assessment to see if you can do anything to make it more robust. On the other hand, you may very often be in the situation that you can easily change the probability 10, 100, perhaps even 1,000 times, and still nothing happens. The injury level stays where it is. And in that case, you know, you have a very robust risk assessment, and you can be very certain that the risk level you're coming up with seems to be realistic. So sensitivity analysis, that's important. Then you need to consider, what do we need? How do we document this report? How can we write up a risk assessment report? Everything, I recommend that every consideration you have done when you prepared the risk assessment must be registered for future use, so that you can come back, because you may have to discuss your risk assessment with the manufacturer. If that is the case, it is very good that you have some notes here and there in the risk assessment explaining, why did you do this? Why did you consider that probability? How did you estimate the risk level, etc., etc. A good risk assessment report, as I said, identifies clearly which is the product, what is a case. It contains some links to your case management system. It describes the context of the risk management, or the context of this accident. Could be something like product has been taken in a routine check, it has been tested by the laboratory, blah, blah, blah. You describe the hazards that you have tried to analyze with the product. And then, of course, it describes injury scenarios, injury levels, probabilities, risk levels, sensitivity, etc., etc. This is a lot, but luckily enough, there is a very good reporting tool integrated in the risk assessment web tool. I've just shown one of the pictures here, but basically what you can see is that everything you put into this system will come out on a report that you could file on the case. And this is really the way you should work. You should produce these risk assessments. You should document as much as possible in the risk assessment report, and then print off the report and file it in your case management system, because then you have it. And then you can always come back if there are some issues coming up with it. If an inspector, if a manufacturer will discuss with you, you can always come back and have the discussion. And the final thing I want to say something about here is quality assurance. What can you do to ensure the quality or check the quality of your risk assessment? And what can you do to avoid subjective judgments in your risk assessment? Well, I've written some tricks here that you should take note of. It's a very good idea to work in pairs or work in groups or discuss with colleagues, because when you do that, you are forced to explain, why did you arrive at the estimate you did? Why did you arrive at the risk level you did? If you can explain that and your colleague says, yeah, I can see that sounds good, then you're on safe ground. On the other hand, if your colleague says, I don't understand that, I don't get that, that's weird. Okay, then you know that you should probably say to your colleague, okay, what would you do then? And you could have a discussion about what would be a reasonable probability, what would be a reasonable scenario. A different way to do this is that you could, if you're running a big project where you're examining many different products, it could be an idea to make the first few risk assessments together, so that you decide, you look at a number of products, you build risk assessment for these, and you discuss them together so that you can use them for future assessment afterwards. So in a way, you can say you build a model risk assessment, and then all the inspectors can afterwards use this in the activities they're having, which can speed up the process. That was what I wanted to say before. I wanted to have a short break, but if you like, if there are some quick questions, we could just have some of these for clarification here, and then we have another session of questions at the very end of the seminar. Do we have anyone in the room who could say if there are any questions? It doesn't seem to be the case. So what I would suggest is then that we have a short break and reconvene here, let's say 10 minutes to 7 Ankara time.
Thank you very much.
Please.
10 minutes is enough. Thank you very much. There is no question from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Sağlığımızı korumak için gerekli koşulları sağlayan üründür. Ürünler yetkili kurumlarca düzenli olarak denetlense de piyasada güvensiz ürünlerle de karşılaşabiliriz. Diyelim ki aldığınız bir üründen şüphelendiniz ve kullanmaktan vazgeçtiniz. Peki ya başka kişiler kullanır ve zarar görürse? Ya sevdiklerimiz? Artık basit ve kalıcı bir çözüm var. Ticaret Bakanlığı'nın Ürün Güvenliği Gov.tr adresine girin. Şüphelendiğiniz gıda dışı bir ürünü kolayca şikayet edin. Şikayetiniz hemen işleme girsin ve gerekli önlemler alınsın. Hem kendi sağlığınızı ve hakkınızı koruyun, hem de sevdiklerinizle birlikte tüm tüketicilerin korunmasına katkı sağlayın. Ürün Güvenliği Gov.tr. Güvenlik bir tık ötenizde. Hey, sen de herkes gibi internetten alışverişin kolaylıklarından faydalanıyorsun. Ya da Covid-19'dan ötürü internetten alışverişe yeni başladın. Peki ya aldığın ürün güvenliği ise? Haklarını biliyor musun? Yeni Ürün Güvenliği Kanunu'yla internetten aldığın ve güvensiz bulduğun ürünleri de rahatlıkla şikayet edebileceksin. Şikayetin yetkili kurumlarca mutlaka işleme alınacak. Ürün güvensizse satışı yapan internet sitesine erişim engellenebilecek, para cezası uygulanabilecek. Güvensiz bulduğun ürün için hemen Ürün Güvenliği Gov.tr'ye gir ve şikayette bul. Hem haklarından faydalan hem de sevdiklerinle birlikte tüm tüketicilerin korunmasına katkıda bul. Ürün Güvenliği Gov.tr. Güvenlik bir tık ötenizde. Ticaret Bakanlığı Ürün Güvenliği ve Denetimi Genel Müdürlüğü.
Burada tercümanlarımız. Buradasınız değil mi? 10 dakika bittiyse. Tamam. Tamam. Hı hı. Okay. Torben, hi.
Yeah, hi.
There are some questions in the
Great.
questions and answers
Good.
part. So
Yep.
I will read them in Turkish and our translators will be translating to you, okay? If
Cool.
you like, we can do it now or at the end of the session, whatever you like. If you like, we can do it now or at the end of the session. We can do it now, okay?
Let's do it now. Yeah.
Okay. Efendim sorularımız var. Onları sormak istiyorum izninizle uzmanımıza. Öncelikle Yasemin Hanım'ın bir sorusu var. Chat bölümün, pardon hemen bakıyoruz chat bölümüne. Chat bölümünde bir şey yazmıyor bununla ilgili. Ben direkt soruları efendim. Bastım canım. Tamam. Tamam. Soru cevap bölümünde. Evet, AB mevzuatına göre
Mhm.
enerji verimliliği ürünleriyle ilgili risk değerlendirmesi yapılır mı? Yapılırsa aynı aracı kullanabilir miyiz? Göz önünde bulundurulacak başka hususlar var mıdır? Ömer Sönmez Bey'in sorusu.
Didn't get the sort of product. Could you repeat or clarify that, please? You said something about what should be taken into consideration in risk assessment of some product, and I didn't get that part.
Evet, cevap olarak bir dakikanızı rica edeyim. Evet. Tamam. Şöyle, Avrupa Birliği mevzuatına göre enerji verimliliği ürünleriyle ilgili risk değerlendirmesi yapılır mı? Yapılırsa aynı aracı kullanabilir miyiz diye sormuş. Bunun dışında da göz önünde bulundurulacak başka hususlar var mıdır?
How can we do a risk assessment of an energy efficiency product? I will come back to some discussions later on in the next session of this training, where I will discuss how to make risk assessment of different products. Let me try to come back to it there. But the one who has raised the question is absolutely correct. It's difficult because the method always assumes that somebody is hurt. And of course, if you have a product that consumes too much energy, then that's not dangerous in itself, you can say. But let me come back to that later on.
Tamam. Ömer Bey özellikle beyaz eşyalar enerji verimliliği kapsamında enerji sınıfını karşılamayan bir buzdolabı gibi bir örnek üzerinden sorusunu yenilemek istedi.
Okay. If we are talking about products that injure consumers because there are some electrical errors inside them, then it's possible to make this method, to use this method. If you are considering products where the control, for instance, means that it consumes too much energy, then you have to make a trick or circumvention, you can say, so that you can use the method still. But I will come back and discuss that later on.
Şu anda başka bir sorumuz yok. Devam edebiliriz Torban. Oradan sorular olursa tekrar oturumun sonunda sizinle paylaşırız Torban.
Good. Great. Thanks. Yeah. Then thanks to everyone for coming back. That's really great, taking the time of the day into consideration. I will spend the last part of this training to discuss pitfalls, and then I will discuss some tips and tricks at the end. What can you do to ensure that you can use this method for risk assessment of different kinds? Pitfalls. What I will discuss is this long list of different questions that have come up. And let me just get started right away. First question is, some people ask, do we always have to do a risk assessment? And the short answer is, yes, you always have to do a risk assessment. Because as we discussed in the beginning, that authorities can only take measures based on risk. So therefore you need the risk assessment. And moreover, if a case ends up in court, then you will always be asked to present a risk assessment, or you will at least have a very good case if you're able to refer to a documented risk assessment where you explain what are the considerations, why did you arrive at the result you arrived at. The next question is that if you have a product that can cause serious injuries, wouldn't that automatically end up in a serious risk? And the answer is, of course, no, because Risk is this combination of severity and probability. So if it is very unlikely that this serious injury will happen, then the risk will be low, even though the severity can be very high. This is probably a special case of the previous ones, but you may come across cases where you have products that are sold in huge numbers. They can injure the consumer in a very bad way, but the probability is very low. And what do you then do? Because you may end up in the situation that the risk level will be medium, perhaps even low. But if you have sold 1 million products on the market or 10 million products on the market, it is quite likely then that serious accidents will happen and people will get seriously injured. In that case, it's important to remember that you can take action. As an authority, you can always take action against products that don't comply, even if the risk is low. Risk assessment is only one input to this risk management process. There are other concerns that you have to take into consideration. Just be sure to document this, write it in your risk assessment report so that you are certain that you can remember afterwards. One of the pitfalls, you can say, is that you can very easily find yourself ending up in a huge number of scenarios. Because if products are hazardous, they can cause injuries in many different ways. And moreover, the same hazard can cause many different sort of injuries. So you can easily find yourself working with 10, 15 scenarios before you realize that something is going out of control. You have to remember some things here, that the best scenarios are short scenarios. The shorter, the better, you can say. Because you can remember, you can imagine that if you are inserting extra steps in an injury scenario, each of these steps would have a probability. It would mean that the risk level, all things equal, would decrease if you add steps. So focus on short scenarios and focus on those scenarios that have the highest combination of probability and severity. And remember that the risk level is determined by the most severe of the scenarios that you've gone through. So if you have analyzed the product and if you have ended up in a situation with a serious risk, then you don't need to analyze anything further, because you know that the risk with this product is serious per definition. It used to be that there was some discussions about vulnerable consumers in the old risk assessment methods. Vulnerable consumers, children, elderly people that probably don't react as quickly or don't understand how dangerous products are. And they're not really included in the RAPEX method. You may remember we clicked a box to identify the type of consumer, but the results are not really used for anything in the method as such. What you can use it for is that you should remember that scenarios become different when you have vulnerable consumers. Adults know that they shouldn't eat button cell batteries. Small children don't know that, and therefore little children eat button cell batteries and they are terribly hurt, whereas adults don't do that. So you can see the injury scenarios turn out to be different depending upon the kind of consumer type. There's also this question, how do you avoid subjectivity? We have already discussed this. Try to work with colleagues, discuss your results with them, and try to use quantitative data taken from reports, from accident statistics, something that is very difficult to argue against. Then it would be possible for you to avoid subjectivity. What then if we have products that don't hurt people, but products that only causes damage to property? The problem is that this method always presumes that you end up in a situation where the person is injured. You can deal with this in two ways. One way is that you can create a scenario where a person is injured. The other way you can do it is to try to develop some categories that are more or less equivalent to the 4 different severity levels you have. If you try to think of an electrical product that will cause a fire, then a scenario, I mean, this is unacceptable and it could be a hazardous, could be a serious risk. If you follow the first model, then you will develop a scenario that goes something like, the product is dangerous because it can overheat. Something happens to the product so that it overheats and the plastic housing catches fire. This fire ignites something in the room where it's standing. This generates smokes. In the room nearby or next to the room with the appliances, you have somebody sleeping. The person inhales toxic fumes and dies. So you can see we've created this story that starts with an unsafe product and end up with a person getting injured. The problem is that this ends up being a very long story with many steps. So another way to do it is to develop this four level scale where we try to say, how severe do we consider fires to be? And what I've done here is to say that severity level 1, the bottom would correspond to some pieces of furniture that are affected. They have burn marks, they have smoke, something like that. And then you go through step 2, step 3, up to step 4, where you have a whole building, where you have several rooms that are destroyed by the fire. Because in this case, what you can do is you can develop a much shorter scenario, saying something like, this product does not comply, an error occurs, that means the product overheats, it catches fire and puts fire to the room, and afterwards the whole building, the whole house burns out. In that sense, you have a very much shorter scenario, and you can develop, and you can still assess the risk level, you can say. And this brings me back to this question about energy efficiency. Because if you look at energy efficiency, the sort of harm you are causing to the consumer is financial. The consumer purchases a product, he believes it's very, very efficient, and then he assumes that he will pay 200 euros extra to buy a product that he believes is an A++. In reality, it is perhaps a D model, which means that it consumes a lot more energy every year. What you can do is that you can take this harm, you can say, to society, or harm to the individual, and try to put it into the same sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 grading we have here. And I can say that this list I've included here with the 4 different levels of fire is by and large based on financial considerations. So that's step number 1, how much does it cost if you have some pieces of furniture that get burn marks? Well, it costs perhaps a couple of €100, perhaps 1,000 euros. And then you can go all the way up until you have what is the cost of a whole building, a whole home that is burning down? That's probably 100,000 euros. And that sense, you can develop this sort of scale where you're explaining what are the different severity levels corresponding to different harms caused by the product. So in principle, it's possible to make this circumvention, you can say, and make a scale where you can actually fit other sorts of harm into. We also had, at least before, some people asking, where do we start the scenarios? Where do we end the scenarios? Because stories can go on forever. What I always do is that I analyze, I think about this hypothetical scenario that I have put up on the screen here. You take the non-compliant product, you give it to a consumer, and then you see what happens. And if you try to build your scenario around these 3 steps, then you would almost always end up in short scenarios with 4, 5, 6 steps, because that's about the ideal size of a scenario. What do we do if you come across products that have many risks, many high risks perhaps? Would that mean that the whole product could become a serious risk product? No. Risks don't accumulate. Each of the risks have to be considered individually. But of course, if you have a product that fails on a lot of different parameters, then it makes sense that you can come back to the manufacturer and say, look, this is a junky product, you have to make something about it and you cannot sell it. It does not necessarily mean that it becomes a serious risk product, but you can come back and you can tell the manufacturer that the product has to be taken off the market and something has to be done. The only thing that you should take into consideration is that if you have many hazards in a product, then they may interact in some or another way so that the overall probability of injuries happening could increase. So there may be some sort of link or linkage between the different ones. Finally, the question here is if it's possible to recall a product that only poses a low risk. And yes, it is, because this has nothing to do with risk assessment. This is something about risk management. And as an authority, you have to take action against products if they don't comply with the legal requirements. And as we've been discussing before, risk assessment and risk level is only one of the factors that goes into the decision on the measure. There are different measures like how likely is it that injuries will happen, how severe are injuries, etc., besides the risk level. So these are some of the pitfalls that you have to look out for. And then let me finish with a number of tips and tricks that could help you use this method under different conditions and for different product types. These are the different things, different topics I will be discussing here. Something about, there are some very specific advice, and then there's a lot about how to use it on different risks, different product types. But let's get started. The first step, or the first trick, is something we already discussed briefly. I said, remember to make your steps as explicit, as precise as possible, because then it's a lot easier to estimate probabilities. Again, I have a standard scenario that I always work from. It has these 5 steps that are shown here. The product is non-compliant. The product is in use. The user triggers the dangerous situation. The non-compliance shows, and the user is injured. If you always try to work from this standard scenario, it becomes easier to develop, and it becomes easier to make the scenario. And then what you need to do is only to describe each of the steps as precisely as possible. I've given an example at the bottom because the 5th step, the user is injured, should describe exactly what kind of injury does the consumer get and how severe is it. So, like we said before, the user gets an electric shock and is killed, because then you have the injury described and you have the severity exactly defined in this text. Then I have a lot of comments about estimating probabilities, because that is what is always tricky. If you have ever been working with risk assessment, you try to estimate probabilities, you know that it's tricky. You know that it's very difficult to argue why is 1 in 10 a more correct value than 1 in 100. Sometimes it's possible to make some estimates based on pretty hard facts like accident statistics. I remember a long time ago, we were trying to look at how likely is it that a kid gets suffocated or suffocate if it puts something into its mouth. And there was a German who was able to find some injury statistics from a hospital saying that every year they had, I think it was 50,000 kids reporting to emergency rooms because they had swallowed something. And each year they had 50 kids dying because of this object that went into their throats. So in that sense, you could say, okay, the probability that you die when you swallow an object is 1 in 1,000. And you could say it's based on facts, accident statistics. It may also be that you could look into test reports, or you could examine the product. You could make different sort of studies, polls, search the internet. But basically, you almost always end up in what I would call qualified guessing. And you will always find that it's tricky, it's disputable, and that's why I recommend that you ensure that you describe why you arrived at the figure you arrived at. Let me try to come with some more specific advice. I had a colleague once in ProSafe that found it was a lot easier for him to estimate probabilities if he used this table that could be found in this ProSafe Best Practice Handbook, or the EMARS book. In this table, you can see that you have the probability listed in the middle column, more than 50%, more than 1 in 10, more than 1 in 100. And then in the left column, you have a verbal description of the probability level. So more than 50%, that is translated into almost certain, might very well be expected. So what he did was, when he was going to judge something, he said, I cannot see if it's 1 in 100, if it's 1 in 1,000, or 1 in 10,000. But what I can say is, if it is unusual but possible, or if it's remotely possible, or if it is conceivable but highly unlikely. It made more sense to him. And the table is there, so why not use it if you feel that it could help you? Another idea that I've been using myself often is that you try to imagine a hypothetical situation that corresponds to the step that you want to estimate. And you try to make this imagination very, very lively. Try to make it as precise in your head as possible. Try to imagine that you take 100 consumers and you put them in the situation that you want to estimate. The tricky thing, or the good thing, is that this, in a way, can trigger your analytical skills that you have, meaning that it's possible for you to actually analyze this situation and come up with an estimate that may be more robust than what you can come up with just by guessing or picking something from the air. I have an example, and as I said, don't try this at home. But imagine that we're looking at this situation. We have an injury scenario that says a pushchair is unstable. It begins to roll down a slope. It hits an obstacle and turns over, and the child breaks an arm. And the question is, what is the probability in the last step? What is the probability that the child will break its arm? And the idea is that try to imagine that you have a hypothetical experiment. Of course, this is unethical and everything, but still try to imagine this experiment. As long as you only imagine, you can do whatever you want. So you take this situation, you have some doctor coming up in a white dress, and he puts 100 children in a pushchair, each in a pushchair, and then push them down this slope. And what will happen? As I said, the point is, I think it's easier to analyze such a situation because you can think about what will happen when this pushchair turns over, the child will fall out. How many of these children will actually break their arm if they're treated by this, treated in this way? So you're using your analytical skills to make this analysis that will end up in estimated probability. I've also come across this method that is very, very simple, very easy to go by. It's taken from the budgetary world, so it has to do with money, but it might work here as well. But the idea is that you make a pessimistic guess, you make an optimistic guess, and then you make a guess on what the most likely value is. And then your estimate is calculated as shown here. You add the pessimistic guess, the optimistic guess, and 3 times the most likely value and divide by 5, and you have a value. It's a way of estimating. To be frank, I have never used it myself when estimating probabilities, but if it works, if you find that it works well, then it's good. I have more experience with the next method, the Delphi method. It is described as a structured communication technique, but the idea is that if you take a group of people and ask them to estimate a probability, then you will most likely have a better estimate than if you just have one person, one individual coming up with an estimate. The method works in this way. You start by presenting the problem for the experts that will have to make the estimate. So you can say, we have this situation, the pushchair. What is the probability that kids will break their arm if the pushchair turns over? And then you ask the experts to give their estimate. They write it down on a piece of paper. You collect all these pieces and you put them up on a wall, or you make some sort of anonymous summary where you can put all the explanations why people have ended up with this or that estimate. Therefore, you end up with an average value saying something, and you present this to the experts. Say, okay, these were the answers. Try to review your own estimate in the view of these answers, and see if you want to change anything. And experience shows that after 2, 3, perhaps 4 rounds, you're suddenly in the situation that people have more or less agreed on a result. They have agreed on a probability. And that final result is then your estimate. What is important here is that you must be very precise when you describe the situation that you want to estimate. Sometimes you can end up in the situation that the results converge towards 2 estimates, high one and a low one. That is always if that is the case, it is because you have not been precise enough in describing what the situation is. So people are making different assumptions. Then you need to go back, rewrite the description or reconsider the description to agree exactly on what you want to estimate, and then try again one more time to run this exercise. But this is efficient. It's being used a lot in different sorts of forecasting, but we can see that it also works when we're discussing estimation of probabilities. Then let me turn to another way of doing it. Sometimes it's possible from simple geometrical conditions to estimate the probability. Let's consider this case that deals with a pure technical article, a battery, a cake, it's also called, one of these combinations with perhaps 20 shot tubes that will shoot different effects into the air where they will explode. And the non-compliance is that this product is unstable. It turns over when it shoots, and then it begins to swirl around and shoot in all different directions. And the question is, what is the probability that a spectator will be hit by a shot fired from this battery? Well, you can actually do a rather simple geometrical calculation here, because if you have the situation, you will have the battery lying here in the middle of a circle, swirling around and shooting in all different directions. And the question is, how wide is the person that is standing at some distance from this battery, perhaps 8 meters away? How much room does this person take up? How many degrees will he take up? Because then you can calculate the probability as the number of degrees that this person takes up divided by 360. You can also imagine that this situation can be used if you have power tools that are ejecting objects while they're working, or breaking and ejecting objects. In that case, it could be something like comparing what is the size of an upper body of a human being compared to the sphere that where these objects are ejected through. We have used that in ProSafe many years ago when we tried to estimate what the probability was that an object, a flying object, would end up in the eye of a person. Again, something about geometry. What is the area of the eye compared to the area of the face, and that sort of thing. Enough about probabilities. Let me also mention that we have there has been developed a large number of risk assessment templates, and they are today included in a template library in this RAG tool. Risk assessment templates is a very good thing, because what they do is that they try to list likely scenarios for how different, in what ways will different non-compliances injure a consumer. So imagine that you are considering a pram, for instance. What is the risk of that will happen if there's a small part inside the pram? If you look into a template, to the risk assessment template for the prams, I'm pretty certain that you will be able to find one of the risks or one of the scenarios that covers small parts, and then it's just copy paste, and you can fill in things and finalize your risk assessment in a hurry. And moreover, you can be sure that you're using a scenario that a lot of others are using. What you do is that you go to the RAG tool, and then where the arrow points, you can see it says template library. Find the template you want to use, load it, and then you must check the scenario critically to check that it actually matches the situation that you're analyzing. If it does, estimate probabilities and go ahead full speed. And just to give you an impression, I've listed all the different risk assessment templates here. And you can see they cover almost any kind of product you can imagine. These templates have been developed as part of joint actions, many of them coordinated by ProSafe, but also a lot of them run by ADCO groups or the Commission themselves. So they have been developed and they've been checked by market surveillance experts everywhere. So they represent really a sort of best practice in risk assessment of the different products. So again, it's a very big recommendation to use these, because they will help you when you're doing the risk assessment of your products. Then some of you are probably working with chemicals. How do you do risk assessment of chemicals? Then you also know that such a risk assessment is very, very difficult from how the RAG tool actually works. In the chemical world, we're speaking about hazard identification, hazard characterization, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. And this corresponds to our injury scenarios or hazards, etc. But the methods don't fit together. I've inserted this little picture that shows, in principle, the considerations that you have to have when you're doing chemical risk assessment. Because to the left, you have a chemical that is contained in a product. It's red because it's dangerous. This product, some other way, migrates out of this article into water, air, whatever. And from there, the product, some other way, goes to the surface of the body of a body, or it can be inhaled, or it could be ingested. And afterwards, some of the chemical will end up inside the body, will go through the skin or go through the inner organs, so that you get it inside your body. And in principle, you have to make some sort of study or analysis of each of these steps to find out how many percent of the chemical will migrate into the open air, how many percent will migrate onto the surface of the body, etc. So you can imagine this is a very cumbersome and very difficult way to do risk assessment. And it's very difficult from the RAC method. The European Commission and the member states developed a shortcut to this some years ago, because what they said was, yeah, but all this work about all the studies of the different steps where the chemical goes out of the product and into the body, it has been analyzed. It is being analyzed by a scientific committee, and the result is that there is a threshold value in the REACH regulation, for instance. Why not reuse that information? So what they did was that they said, okay, if the chemical is regulated, if there is a limit value in REACH or in the Toy Safety Directive or elsewhere, and if this threshold value is backed up by a scientific opinion, if the scientific committee has analyzed this situation and come up with an opinion, and if the exposure scenarios are similar, because the scientific opinion will of course always say in this and this condition, then this will happen. If the exposure scenarios are similar, and if the threshold value from the legislation is exceeded, then you can, by and large, you can basically just say that, okay, we assume that the risk is serious, and we don't go into further examinations. What you do is simply that you have to check that the scenario, you can say, developed by the scientific committee, your scenario is worse, because then you can already say, okay, the risk is serious, and full stop. That's a very elegant and clever way of utilizing this knowledge, and it makes life a lot easier for a lot of the European market surveillance authorities. Then we have this question of how can you assess protective equipment, the risk with protective equipment. This is tricky because protective equipment is seldom dangerous in itself. Think of a face mask that is non-compliant. The face mask is most likely not dangerous in itself, but it becomes dangerous because the user believes he is wearing a face mask that protects him from corona, but it doesn't. He exposes himself to all sorts of risky situations and he gets infected. But that's not because the PPE is dangerous, it's because it doesn't protect adequately. What we've seen is that it normally fits into this standard scenario that I discussed before. The product is used, non-compliant, blah, blah, blah. So try to develop such a standard scenario every time. And we have some help for you because there are some examples in a document called ProSafe Tips and Tricks that you could find on ProSafe's websites. I will give you a link later on. There are some examples there that consider the products you can see listed here. Residual current device, which is an electric product with protective properties, helmets, protective masks, visibility vests, socket protectors, and CO detectors. But this document on tips and tricks is very much recommended. Likewise, there is a guide that discusses risk assessment of noisy toys. And you can imagine that the discussion would be, how dangerous is it that a certain level is exceeded by 20 dB for a few minutes? Is that dangerous? This guideline was developed and it considers all the 11 types of toys that you will find in EN 71. And we had this audiology professor who was supporting the work, who came up with complete scenarios, injury severity levels, and everything. The results are generally applicable, I would say, but they have been developed and the scenarios have been developed so that they describe toys. Again, this guide is openly available from ProSafe's website. On ProSafe's website, you will also find a guideline that discusses how to make risk assessment of products where warnings or instructions are missing. the guideline is developed and for power tools, angle grinders, I think it was, and it describes different scenarios, injury severity levels, probabilities. But again, these results can be applied more generally on other sorts of products where warnings are missing. And again, the guideline is free and you can just enter the ProSafe website and download it. And the final guide I want to tell you about is a guideline that was developed to help risk assessment of fireworks. It describes scenarios, injury levels, etc. for the different types of fireworks that you will find in the fireworks standards, the EN 15947 series. And again, ProSafe website, free, openly accessible, so feel free to download it. The presentation, I've given some of this advice, go here and find something, go there and find something. And I would just give you some links or some hints where to find the stuff here. If you go to ProSafe's website, there is a risk assessment library where you can find different things like the EMARS book, guidelines and other documents. And you access it by going to prosafe.org, click on horizontal topics, and click on risk assessment library. We also have this e-learning module on risk assessment where you can study risk assessments in quite some detail. It's quite thorough discussion or quite thorough training. And again, there is the path you have to follow there. It's openly accessible. You don't need any login to go into to play with the software, so feel free to do so. The risk assessment tool itself is also publicly available on this address, ec.europa.eu/RAG. And on the same website, on the same page, it will be possible to download the risk assessment guidelines, but you can also download them following this link to Eurlex. So yeah, I imagine that this presentation will be circulated afterwards, so you can use the links directly. That was what I wanted to say, so thank you very much for hanging around for so long. I'm happy to take questions if something has turned up in the chat or if there's something elsewhere from the audience.
We have one question in English, Torben. Funda Hanım asks if there is an international standard which can be applied to all products for risk assessment, including quantitative scales for severity and probability.
I don't think, I haven't heard about such a standard. I know that standards are being developed to cover different sorts of risk assessment for consumer goods. But I remember many years ago, Senelec participated somewhere and looked at some of this stuff and said, look, it looks excellent to go into a standard, but I haven't heard that it is put into a standard. Mm-hmm. Most of the standards that you will find deal with pre-market risk assessment that the manufacturer has to do to prove that the product is correct or is safe. I haven't really seen anything that that would cover this sort of risk assessment.
Sunumda anlattığınız örneğe benzer şekilde risk değerlendirmesi yapılmış vaka örneklerine detaylı risk değerlendirmesi raporlarına ulaşabileceğimiz bir veri tabanı var mı?
Yes, there are different sources where you can reach risk assessment cases. If you look at ProSafe's website on the e-learning portal or the e-learning module, mm-hmm. you will find several examples there that have been worked through, like we worked through the toaster, but there are different examples. the guidelines also contains short scenarios where you can see how the different products, how different risks can be assessed. And then actually what you can also do is that you can go into the RAPEX system or the EU safety gate system. Because if you can have the full detail about one of these products, then there is a risk assessment. All authorities, when authorities takes measures and notify products to RAPEX, they have to come up with a risk assessment, and they are uploaded together with a case. And it should be possible to have some look there, have a look there, and examine the risk assessments.
Diğer sorumuz, risk analizi yaparken N12100 risk analizi standardını referans olarak kullanabilir miyiz? EN12100.
Yes, the EN 12100 standard, the intention with that is to provide manufacturers of machinery with a tool that would allow them to make the risk assessment that they have to produce as part of their compliance assessment. So the EN 12100 is a very good standard for manufacturers that want to analyze their machinery before they can put it on the market.
Risk değerlendirmesi yapıldıktan sonra hangi risk seviyesi için hangi önlemlerin alınacağı nasıl belirlenir?
What I would recommend is that this risk assessment method we have just discussed fits to consumer products and all the kind of risks that you will come across, electrical risks, mechanical risks, physical risks. If you remember the list of hazards, it was extremely long, so it can handle a lot of different cases. It's really only chemistry or chemicals that fit poorly into this. And then you can probably think of some cases of very specific, like cosmetics or medical equipment or some sort that probably don't fit into this. But all the consumer product risks can be dealt with by this method, I would say. You can also, I mean, if you look into RAPEX, you can see how many different products that are handled by RAPEX, and they have basically been risk assessed using this method or this chemical shortcut that I just discussed.
Bir diğer soruda birden fazla ciddi risk durumu olmayan bir ürün varsa hangi önlem alınır diye soruyor.
If a product only has got one risk, I would still follow this method and use it to determine the risk level to show that it is a serious risk.
Hangi risk seviyesinde iktisadi işletme uyarılır sadece? Hangi risk seviyesinde piyasaya arz yasaklanır? Ve hangi risk seviyesinde piyasadan çekme ve geri çağırma yapılır?
That's a very good question because actually you use several different inputs to determine whether you want to recall a product or whether you want to span the states, etc. You cannot make the link directly from a risk level to a measure. there's always some further considerations you need to consider, like how widespread is the product, where does it end up, who uses it, etc. And then regarding when do you notify the economic operator, that is something you would always do if you are about to take a measure against something. Then you would need to consult the manufacturer and ensure that you have taken everything into account before you make the measure.
Bir diğer soruda RAPEX aracında havai fişekler için hazır şablon veya senaryo var mı?
I just have to check. No, there's nothing for fireworks. But if you look into the ProSafe guide on risk assessment of fireworks, you will find quite detailed description.
Nedir sorun? Torben, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Sanırım bağlantıda bir sorun yaşıyoruz sayın katılımcılar. Önemli değil, biraz bekleyebiliriz. Torben sorularımıza kaldığı yerden devam edecek. Torben, can you hear me? You are muted. Yes. Can you hear me? Torben, can you hear me? We can't hear you. Your voice is very low. We can hear it very low. Can you try connecting through your mobile phone? The level of the voice is too low. I can't hear you. Okay, we can't hear you, so maybe this is a sign for finishing it. Finish the session.
Can you hear me now?
Ah, okay, I can hear you now. Okay.
We're close to finishing. Safe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You were saying something, but we can't hear you from
Now,
some point.
I think what happened was that I ran out of power.
Let me ask the last question.
Yeah.
Everybody is exhausted right now, and
understand.
this is the
Yeah.
last question. Okay, I'm asking. Risk değerlendirmesi sonucunda ciddi risk skalasında yer alan ürün ile güvensiz ürün farkı terminoloji olarak nedir? Daha doğrusu sizin için güvensiz ürün kavramı ne anlama gelmektedir?
Can we have the interpreter, please?
You have to choose the translation. Did you choose the translation?
Oh, let me just check. Sorry. It's late. Now I'm on English translation.
Okay.
I think if I was going to say something on this, I would say that an unsafe product is a product that can hurt a consumer in some or another way. If a product is a high-risk product, it means that you have made the risk assessment. You have estimated probabilities, you have estimated severity, and that means that you can make a more qualified characterization of the risk level, whereas unsafe just means, well, not safe.
Okay, Torben, I would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation and also the practical one. Thank you for joining us and sharing this information with us. Saygıdeğer katılımcılar, çok teşekkür ediyoruz efendim. Bu saate kadar bizlerle birlikte bu güzel sunuma katıldınız. Yarın sabah 9.30 itibariyle kalan oturumlarımızla devam edeceğiz programımıza. Yarına kadar esenlikler diliyoruz efendim. İyi günler.